New York City, a place of endless possibilities, towering skyscrapers, and bustling streets. But beneath the glimmering lights lies a shadowy underworld of terror and mystery. Tonight, we're diving deep into 12 of the most horrifying cases that have haunted the Big Apple. These stories are not for the faint of heart. So turn down the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for the chilling secrets of the city that never sleeps. Story number 1. The Williamsburg Slasher, 2000s. The Williamsburg Slasher first struck on a chilly night in 2003. And even now, years later, the case still haunts me. I was a young detective back then, just starting to get my footing in the chaotic world of crime scenes and autopsy reports. Brooklyn had its fair share of horror stories, but the slasher was something else. A ghost who lurked in the dark streets of Williamsburg, vanishing before anyone could catch a glimpse of him. The first victim was a young woman, found in the alleyway behind her apartment. I remember the scene well. Her body was discovered at dawn by a sanitation worker, her face pale and still, her neck slashed in a clean, merciless line. She was left there like a discarded doll, the blood already pooling into the cracked pavement. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. It was as if she'd been caught completely unaware, or as if she'd willingly followed her killer into the shadows. Her name was Emily Sanders, and she had been on her way home from a late-night shift at a nearby cafe. She was a quiet girl, no enemies to speak of, just another face in the bustling neighborhood. But in death, she became the first note in a haunting symphony that would play out over the coming months. The night I first stepped onto that alleyway, I felt something strange in the air, something thick and almost suffocating. It was cold, biting through my jacket, but it wasn't just the winter chill. It was something else, something wrong. I had this strange, gnawing feeling that we were being watched, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow flicker at the end of the alley. But when I turned, there was nothing there, just darkness. We investigated the crime as we would any other, but with every day that passed, the fear in Williamsburg grew. And then, 2 weeks later, it happened again. Another woman, same clean slash across her neck, same vacant, frozen eyes staring up into the night. We found her body in a deserted lot, surrounded by broken bottles and graffiti-covered walls, the remnants of a quiet rebellion against the gentrification creeping into the neighborhood. The press named him the Williamsburg Slasher, a moniker that stuck, and soon the whole city knew of him. Williamsburg transformed overnight. Streets that had once thrummed with life fell silent after dark, and people moved with a new cautiousness, casting glances over their shoulders. Every alley, every shadow, became a potential hiding place for the monster lurking among them. As for me, I was obsessed. Each night, after hours at the precinct, I would walk the streets of Williamsburg, hoping to catch some trace of him, some clue he might have left behind. But every time I got close, I felt it, that thick, eerie feeling, like something watching from the darkness, something that didn't want to be found. One night, I got a tip from a local bartender who claimed he'd seen a man in a dark coat following one of the slasher's later victims the night she disappeared. I tracked him down to an old bar tucked between two abandoned buildings, its neon sign barely flickering to life. Inside, the bartender told me the man had been quiet, blending in with the shadows, but there was something off about him, something predatory. As I walked back to the precinct, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The streets were empty, but I felt eyes on me, heavy and piercing, quickened my pace. The sound of my own footsteps echoing against the brick walls, my breath coming out in clouds in the frigid night air. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just shadows stretching along the cracked pavement, reaching toward me like fingers. Back at the precinct, I was going through the reports when I felt a sudden drop in temperature. The room growing colder, the lights flickering. It was faint, but I heard it, a whisper. I looked up, heart pounding, but I was alone. Help us. It was barely a murmur, the voice thin and trembling, like it had traveled across time just to reach me. I tried to shake it off, but that whisper lingered, echoing in my mind. Even when I lay down to sleep, the bodies kept coming, each one bearing that same cold brutality. I began noticing strange details, scratches on the walls near where the bodies were found. Symbols I couldn't identify. They looked like jagged lines, crosses intersecting circles, marks that didn't belong. First, I thought they were just graffiti, but then I started seeing them on the victims too, carved faintly into their arms or scratched onto the ground nearby. Each time, the symbol was slightly different, like a signature evolving with each kill. I asked around, consulted with an old friend who was well-versed in the occult. He told me the symbols resembled those used in ancient rituals, markings meant to bind or summon something beyond our understanding. His words shook me. Could it be that the slasher wasn't just a killer, but something else? Something that had crossed over from another world? Driven by a mix of fear and obsession, I returned to the scenes alone, hoping to find something we'd missed. One freezing night, I stood in the alley where the first victim had been found, tracing the strange symbol into the dirt with a gloved finger. That's when I felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on me. The shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into a form at the end of the alley, a figure in a dark coat, his face hidden in shadow. My blood ran cold as he took a step forward, his movement almost gliding, unnatural. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just stood there, watching me with a gaze that felt like it could pierce my soul. And then, in an instant, he was gone, dissolving into the darkness as if he'd never been there at all. I stumbled out of the alley, my mind racing. That night, the whisper came again, stronger this time, pleading, "Help us, free us." I knew, then, that the slasher wasn't just killing for pleasure. He was hunting for something, trying to complete some dark ritual, leaving behind a trail of blood as an offering. But to what? The case went cold, the slasher's killings suddenly stopping as abruptly as they'd begun. Williamsburg slowly returned to life, the fear ebbing, replaced by the usual hum of city noise. But I couldn't let it go. I kept seeing the shadows in my dreams, kept hearing that whispered plea in the quiet hours. One night, I visited the last crime scene, hoping for answers. I traced the symbol on the ground, whispering the words that had haunted me for years. "Help us, free us." As the words left my lips, the air grew cold, and the figure appeared again, flickering in and out of focus, a specter bound by shadows. He stared at me, his hollow eyes filled with a kind of sorrow I couldn't comprehend. For a brief moment, I saw them, the faces of the women he'd killed, their spirits trapped within the dark marks he'd carved into them. Bound to him, the figure's face twisted in agony, his form disintegrating as he reached out one last time, fingers stretched toward me. "Help us!" With a final, shuddering breath, he vanished, leaving me alone in the silence, the weight of his victim's sorrow lingering in the air. To this day, I can still hear their voices, faint whispers that drift through the streets of Williamsburg. I walk those streets sometimes, and in the stillness of the night, I see glimpses of the shadows, feel the chill of something that lingers, unfinished. The Williamsburg slasher may be gone, but the echoes of his crimes remain, a reminder of the darkness that once gripped the city. And though I never solved the case, I know that part of me will always be bound to those shadows, haunted by the faces of the women who pleaded for justice from beyond the grave. Story number 2. The Vanderbilt murder, 1912. The year was 1912, and Manhattan was as bustling as ever. I was a young detective then, just a few years on the force, when a murder shook the very foundation of New York society. The victim was none other than John William Vanderbilt, heir to one of the most powerful families in America. A Vanderbilt dead in his own apartment. It was the kind of case that would haunt a man's dreams. I remember the call came in the early hours of a cold autumn morning. The police captain himself summoned me to the Vanderbilt residence, a stately building overlooking Central Park. As I arrived, the city was still wrapped in darkness, the lights casting long shadows on the quiet streets. I was used to death, but this time, an uneasy chill settled over me as I crossed the threshold. The Vanderbilt apartment was lavish, furnished in dark wood and silk, reeking of old money. But beneath the luxury, there was something else, something heavy. As I walked down the hall, I could feel the weight of a family secret lingering in the air. John Vanderbilt's body was in his study, a room filled with heavy leather-bound books and a grand mahogany desk. He was slumped over in his chair, his face twisted in horror, eyes wide open as if he'd seen something dreadful. The room was unnaturally cold, colder than it should have been, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. At first glance, there were no signs of forced entry, no hint of a struggle. Yet, John's body was marked by something horrific. A single, deep gash across his chest, the wound so clean it looked almost surgical. Blood had pooled around him, staining the ornate rug beneath his feet. The scene was chilling, the kind that stayed with you long after you left. I noticed a strange symbol carved into the desk, something that looked like a twisted cross with curved edges, surrounded by circular patterns. It didn't match any of the common religious or mystical symbols I'd seen. It seemed foreign, otherworldly, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The other detectives arrived shortly after, whispering among themselves, speculating on who might want a Vanderbilt dead. They spoke of jealous lovers, business rivals, even the murmurings of some dark curse. But none of us could make sense of the symbol carved into the desk, or the strange sensation that lingered in the room. Over the days that followed, I became obsessed with the case. I pored over old files, researched symbols, talked to every person who had been remotely close to Vanderbilt. But every lead led to a dead end. Every answer opened up more questions. And the strange occurrences didn't stop there. On one particularly late night, I decided to return to the scene. The Vanderbilt apartment was still sealed off, preserved as it had been that night. As I entered, a thick silence enveloped me, and the air was colder than ever. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and echoing in the stillness. As I stood in the study, a strange sensation washed over me, a feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, flashlight in hand, but there was no one there, just shadows flickering against the walls, shadows that seemed to move and shift in unnatural ways. Then, faintly, I heard it, a whisper, "Leave now." I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice was low, gravelly, and filled with a sense of warning. I looked around, scanning the room, but there was no one, just me, and the lingering chill that had settled into my bones. "John," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't believe in ghosts, but at that moment, logic seemed like a distant memory. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, and the lights flickered. In the brief flash of darkness, I saw him, John Vanderbilt, standing by the desk, his face as pale as death, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at me, mouth moving as if to speak, but no sound came out. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me alone in the darkness. Heart pounding, mind reeling, I staggered out of the apartment, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me, something dark and malignant. The haunting continued for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanderbilt's face, heard the whispers echoing in my mind. My superiors grew concerned. They saw the toll the case was taking on me, suggested I take some time off, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what had happened in that room. I sought out experts on the occult, historians, anyone who might help me understand the strange symbol and the horror that seemed bound to the Vanderbilt family. My search eventually led me to an old mystic, a reclusive man who lived in a cluttered bookstore filled with ancient texts. When I showed him the symbol, his face went pale. He told me it was a binding mark, an ancient symbol used to trap malevolent spirits. He explained that the symbol had roots in European folklore and was often used by families desperate to protect their own legacies, to bind dark forces within their homes so that they couldn't escape and wreak havoc. But the binding came with a cost. If broken, he said, his voice a barely audible whisper, the spirit will be unleashed, and it will seek vengeance. My blood ran cold. Could it be that John Vanderbilt had tried to break the binding? Had he unwittingly unleashed something that had been contained for generations? That night, I returned to the Vanderbilt apartment for the final time, determined to put an end to whatever horror was trapped within those walls. Armed with the mystic's instructions, I traced the symbol on the desk, completing the broken lines, hoping to reseal whatever malevolent force had been unleashed. As I worked, the temperature in the room plummeted, and I felt a heavy presence looming over me. Shadows gathered in the corners, stretching, twisting into forms that looked almost human. I could feel eyes watching me, an anger so intense it was nearly tangible. I whispered the incantation the mystic had taught me, my voice shaking as I traced the symbol. The shadows began to writhe, contorting in agony as the binding took hold. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room fell silent. But the silence was not empty. In the stillness, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Thank you. The shadows receded. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I left the apartment that night, knowing that whatever had haunted the Vanderbilt family for generations was finally at rest. The case was never solved in the official records. To the world, John Vanderbilt's murder remains an unsolved mystery, a cold case from a bygone era. But I know the truth. I know the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of this city, the spirits that cling to old grudges, to ancient binds and broken promises. The Vanderbilt apartment has since been renovated, turned into luxury condos, its dark past long forgotten. But sometimes, when I walk past that building, I feel a chill in the air, a whisper that lingers on the wind, and I remember the night I came face to face with the shadows that haunt Manhattan's oldest secrets. Story number 3. The Son of Sam Murders, 1976 to 1977. The summer of 1976 in New York City was thick with heat and tension. As a young detective, I had seen my fair share of crimes in the bustling metropolis, but nothing had prepared me for the terror that would soon grip our streets. My name is Detective Robert Hayes, and I was one of the officers assigned to investigate the series of gruesome murders that would come to define our careers and haunt our dreams. It started innocuously enough, random assaults, a few victims here and there, but by July, the pattern became horrifyingly clear. The attacks were brutal, almost ritualistic, targeting young women walking alone at night. Each scene was left with a signature mark, strange symbols carved into the victims' bodies and cryptic messages that seemed to hint at something beyond our understanding. The media quickly dubbed the perpetrator Son of Sam, a moniker that sent shivers down everyone's spines. The public was terrified, and the pressure to catch the killer was immense. Late nights at the precinct became routine, filled with frantic discussions and sleepless hours poring over evidence that seemed to lead nowhere. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the city, we received a call that would change everything. Another victim had been found near a deserted alley in the Bronx, her body mutilated beyond recognition. This time, the message left behind was different, a chilling note that read, "Sam, my master." It was then that David Berkowitz entered the picture, a seemingly ordinary young man with no prior criminal record. Berkowitz's eerie demeanor and obsession with Sam, a woman he claimed to communicate with through his pet dog, added a supernatural layer to the investigation. He insisted that Sam's dog had given him orders to carry out the killings, a notion that baffled even the most seasoned officers. As the investigation progressed, Berkowitz's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would leave cryptic messages, taunting us with his knowledge of the crimes before we even discovered them. His fascination with the occult and the supernatural began to blur the lines between reality and nightmare, making us question whether we were dealing with a madman or something far more sinister. One night, I found myself alone at the scene of another attack, the air thick with the scent of blood and fear. The victim was a young woman, her body bearing the same strange symbols as before. As I stood there, trying to piece together the gruesome puzzle, I felt an inexplicable presence. The temperature plummeted, and a dense fog seemed to roll in from nowhere, enveloping me in a suffocating embrace. Suddenly, I heard a low growl, followed by the piercing gaze of a large, spectral dog. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its form shifted between reality and the ethereal plane. "Sam commands," it whispered, the voice resonating in my mind rather than my ears. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the apparition faded into the mist. The encounter left me shaken, questioning my own sanity. Was there truly a supernatural force at play, manipulating Berkowitz, or was it the manifestation of his fractured psyche? Days turned into weeks, and the murders continued, each one more horrifying than the last. The city was on edge, streets deserted after dark, and the fear was palpable. We intensified our efforts, conducting stakeouts and interrogating anyone who might have information. But the son of Sam remained elusive. Then came the breakthrough. A neighbor of Berkowitz reported seeing him near the latest crime scene, his dog lingering in the shadows. We moved swiftly, cornering him in a rundown apartment complex. The confrontation was intense. Berkowitz was defiant, his eyes wild with fear and madness. He insisted that Sam's dog would protect him, that they were bound by a dark pact that he couldn't break. As we apprehended him, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around us deepened. Berkowitz was taken into custody, but the case was far from over. Even behind bars, he continued to whisper about Sam and the supernatural commands that drove him to kill. Months later, Berkowitz was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but the haunting whispers of that case lingered. I often found myself revisiting the crime scenes in my mind, unable to escape the spectral dog and the ghostly presence of Sam. The unresolved questions and the eerie encounters left a lasting impression, a reminder of the thin veil between our reality and the unknown. Years have passed since the son of Sam case, and while the killer remains behind bars, the shadows of those dark nights still haunt me. Central Park, the Bronx alleys, and the deserted streets of Queens are forever etched in my memory. Places where fear and the supernatural intertwined in a dance of horror and mystery. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers carried by the wind, echoing through the empty streets. "Sam commands," they murmur, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never fully solved, and some shadows never truly fade away. The son of Sam may be captured, but the ghosts of those tragic nights continue to wander, whispering their sorrow and seeking the justice that was never fully served. Story number 4. The murder of Patsy Baird, 1980. The Bronx in 1980 was a place where shadows lingered longer than the daylight. The streets buzzed with life, but beneath the surface, darkness festered, unseen and untouched by the casual passerby. My name is Officer Michael Reyes, and I was one of the detectives assigned to the brutal murder of Patsy Baird, a case that would haunt me for years to come. Patsy was a beloved librarian at the local community center, known for her kindness and unwavering dedication to the neighborhood's children. Her death was not just a tragedy. It was an enigma wrapped in blood and unanswered questions. We found her in her small, cluttered apartment on East 175th Street, the scene more gruesome than anything I had ever encountered. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the cool evening breeze. Inside, the apartment was in disarray, books scattered across the floor, furniture overturned, and in the center of it all lay Patsy's lifeless body. The violence was unmistakable. Bruises, deep gashes, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle. But what disturbed me most was the eerie calm that seemed to pervade the room, as if Patsy had known her end was near. As we began the investigation, the community was on edge. Patsy was a pillar of the neighborhood, and her absence left a void that echoed with whispers and fears. The initial search yielded little, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, and no clear motive. It was as if Patsy had been taken from her sanctuary by an unseen hand. Late one night, as I sat in my dimly lit office, poring over the case files, the power flickered and went out, plunging the precinct into darkness. The emergency generators kicked in, but the sudden blackout sent a chill down my spine. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The cold air a stark contrast to the stuffy room I had been confined to. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of traffic replaced by an unsettling silence. As I walked past Patsy's apartment building, I felt a presence, an intangible heaviness that pressed against my chest. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to dance with a life of their own. Suddenly, a soft, sorrowful whisper floated through the night air. "Help me!" I froze, heart pounding, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The voice was faint, almost ethereal, yet it pierced through the silence with an undeniable urgency. Summoning my courage, I approached the building, the whispers guiding me back to the scene of the crime. Inside, the apartment felt different under the dim light of my flashlight. The symbols scratched into Patsy's wall were the first clue we had overlooked, an intricate pattern that seemed to form a map of some sort. As I traced the lines with my finger, the room grew colder, and the whispers intensified, swirling around me like a spectral storm. Find the truth. Free us. Determined to understand. I delved deeper into the symbols, consulting with local historians and occult experts. The patterns were ancient, tied to a forgotten ritual meant to protect or perhaps imprison something. The more I uncovered, the more the apartment seemed alive with restless energy, the spirits of the past echoing Patsy's final moments. One night, as I reviewed new evidence, the air in my office shifted, the lights dimmed, and the temperature plummeted. Patsy's whispers filled the room, urging me to complete the ritual outlined by the symbols. According to the research, the symbols were a binding spell, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps Patsy had attempted to harness powers beyond her understanding, resulting in her untimely death and the lingering spirits now seeking closure. Fueled by a mix of fear and determination, I returned to Patsy's apartment, armed with the knowledge to perform the ritual. The moon was high, casting a ghostly glow through the windows as I arranged the symbols exactly as they appeared on the walls. Chanting the ancient words, I felt the air thicken, the presence of the spirits growing stronger, their whispers turning into urgent pleas. As I completed the final incantation, a surge of energy enveloped the room. The shadows coalesced into tangible forms, ghostly apparitions of Patsy and others who had fallen victim to the same dark forces. Their eyes, filled with sorrow and desperation, fixed on me. "Thank you," Patsy whispered, her voice now clear and filled with peace. "You've set us free." The room brightened, the oppressive darkness lifting as the spirits dissipated into the ether, leaving behind a sense of tranquility that had long been absent. The symbols on the walls faded, their purpose fulfilled. In the aftermath, the case of Patsy Baird remained officially unsolved, but the supernatural elements provided a semblance of closure. The community slowly healed, the fear that had gripped them beginning to subside. Personally, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The haunting whispers silenced by the truth finally brought to light. Years later, I still visit Patsy's apartment, now peaceful and unmarked by the horrors of the past. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the faintest echoes of her voice, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. The shadows of the Bronx hold countless secrets, but Patsy's story remains a testament to the resilience of those who seek justice, even in the face of the supernatural. Story number 5. The murder of Hannah Levin, 1987. In the winter of 1987, Manhattan was cold and unforgiving. The skyscrapers seemed sharper, the wind meaner, and the streets darker. I was a detective back then, working my way through New York City's grimy underbelly, thinking I'd seen it all. But the murder of Hannah Levin changed everything. Hannah was young, a girl who'd come to Manhattan with dreams, like so many others. She lived in a cramped apartment on the Lower East Side, working as a waitress by day and an aspiring actress by night. Her friends described her as vibrant, full of life, and maybe that's why her murder was so horrific, because the light she held within her had been snuffed out in such a brutal way. I was one of the first officers on the scene that night, and even after years of seeing things no one should have to see, Hannah's murder haunted me in ways I couldn't shake. It was a bitterly cold night in December when we got the call. Hannah's neighbor had heard a scream, followed by a chilling silence. By the time we arrived, it was too late. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the drafty hall, as if beckoning us in. I'll never forget the image that greeted us. Hannah lay sprawled in the middle of her apartment, eyes wide open, mouth contorted in a silent scream. There were signs of a struggle, a shattered lamp, overturned furniture, blood smeared on the walls. Her body was marked with cuts and bruises, each one a testament to her final moments. And yet there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever did this, she had let them in. As we combed the scene, piecing together what little we could, a strange chill settled over the room. It wasn't just the winter draft, it was something heavier, a feeling that clung to the air like a fog. Even the other officers felt it. We tried to brush it off as nerves, but deep down, we knew there was something wrong. The days that followed were a blur of witness interviews, dead-end leads, and sleepless nights. We went through every possible suspect, combed through every piece of evidence, but nothing added up. Witnesses reported seeing a man leaving her building, but descriptions varied wildly. Some said he was tall, others swore he was short. One even claimed he was wearing a hat that no one else remembered. And every time we got close to a lead, crumbled in our hands. Hannah's case became an obsession, a shadow that followed me home, haunting my dreams. The feeling of being watched, of someone just beyond reach, grew stronger each night. Then came the whispers. The first time I heard it, I was alone in my office, sifting through files late at night. The station was quiet, everyone else long gone. As I leaned over the case notes, I heard a faint, almost inaudible voice. "Help me." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, but the room was empty, dismissing it as exhaustion. I returned to my work, but the voice persisted, a whisper that seemed to drift through the air, chilling me to the bone. "Find me." I tried to shake it off, but the whispers followed me, growing louder with each passing day. First, they came only at night, when I was alone, but soon they started seeping into every quiet moment, slipping through the cracks of my mind. I'd catch glimpses of Hannah's face in the reflections of shop windows, her wide, terrified eyes staring back at me. One night, I returned to her apartment, hoping for answers. It was abandoned now, empty except for a thin layer of dust and the remnants of her life, photographs on the wall, a stack of books, and her dresser, still holding the faint scent of her perfume. The whispers grew louder as I entered, the air thick with a cold that seeped into my bones. I closed the door behind me, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Hannah stood in the doorway, her ghostly figure pale and shimmering, her eyes filled with the same terror I'd seen on her that night. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her desperation, a silent plea for justice. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She pointed toward the bedroom, her movements slow and deliberate. I followed her gaze, stepping into the small, cluttered room. The whispers grew louder, filling the room like a swarm of bees. On the dresser, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a small silver locket. It was tarnished, almost invisible against the dark wood. But as I picked it up, I felt a shock of cold run through me. Inside the locket was a photograph of Hannah and a man I didn't recognize. His face was obscured, blurred as if by some trick of the camera. But there was something about his eyes, cold, calculating, watching her with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The vision hit me then, a sudden flash of images that flooded my mind. I saw Hannah, standing in her apartment, the man from the locket leaning close to her, his hand on her shoulder, her face twisted in fear, and then everything went dark. I stumbled back, clutching the locket, the room spinning around me. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, anguished scream. I knew then that Hannah's spirit was trapped, bound to this place, unable to rest until justice was served. I returned to the precinct, determined to find the man from the photograph. I combed through every record, every scrap of information we had, and finally, a name surfaced: Robert Kane, an ex-boyfriend with a history of violence. He'd vanished shortly after Hannah's death, leaving no trace. But now, armed with the photograph, I had a lead. Days turned into weeks as I hunted for Kane, following every lead, every whispered tip from informants. The whispers grew stronger, Hannah's voice guiding me, urging me forward. I could feel her presence beside me, a cold comfort in the darkness. Finally, I found him. Kane had been hiding in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, living under a false name. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. His face was pale, eyes hollow, as if haunted by the same ghosts that had plagued me. "She wouldn't leave me alone," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Every night, I saw her, in the mirror, in the shadows. She was always there." With Kane's confession, the case was closed. I returned to Hannah's apartment one last time, hoping to find peace for both of us. As I stepped inside, the coldness was gone, replaced by a sense of calm, a quiet that filled the empty rooms. In the corner of the room, I saw her figure once more, but this time, she was smiling. Her face was soft, the terror replaced by a peace I hadn't seen before. She raised her hand in a silent farewell, and as I blinked, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. It's been years since that winter, but Hannah's memory lingers. I still hear her voice sometimes, a faint whisper in the quiet moments, a reminder of the darkness that once haunted the city. Her case remains one of the most chilling I ever worked, but also one that taught me the power of the unseen, of the voices that refuse to be silenced. Hannah Levin may have been taken from this world, but her spirit lives on, a guardian of the forgotten, a reminder that sometimes justice comes not from the living, but from the whispers of the dead. Story number 6. The murder of Betty Lou Jensen, 1953. The year was 1953, and the Bronx had its fair share of mysteries, but none so haunting as the murder of Betty Lou Jensen. I was a detective back then, young and eager, still green enough to believe I'd seen it all. But the night we found Betty's body, all that changed. She was just a kid, barely out of high school. She had big dreams. People said wanted to be an actress, maybe head to California one day. But instead, her story ended in a dark, empty lot on the edge of the city. The case still keeps me up at night, and though I'm long retired, I can't shake the feeling that I left something unfinished. The call came in the middle of a bitterly cold night in January. Her body had been discovered behind an old warehouse, her life stolen with a brutality that left us all shaken. She was sprawled in the dirt, her face turned upward toward the empty sky, her eyes wide open, frozen in terror. The crime scene was strange. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry or anything to suggest what had happened in those last moments. Just Betty Lou lying there in the cold, her expression so full of fear it twisted something deep inside me. The only clues we found were faint footprints in the snow, leading into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. It was like her killer had simply vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a single, chilling message: stay away. For days, I worked tirelessly, questioning anyone who might have known her, tracking down every lead, no matter how thin. Friends described her as a sweet girl, quiet, with no known enemies. But as I dug deeper, I found whispers, rumors of a shadowy figure that had followed her for weeks before she disappeared. One night, frustrated and unable to sleep, I found myself driving back to the crime scene. I don't know what I was hoping for, maybe a new clue, or some kind of sign to point me in the right direction. But what I found was something I never expected. As I walked through the empty lot, I felt a sudden chill. It wasn't just the cold. It was something deeper, a feeling that crept into my bones. I heard a sound, a soft, faint whisper, carried by the wind. First, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe a trick of the winter breeze. But as I listened, I realized it was more than that. Help me. The voice was barely audible, a breathy, broken whisper. My heart raced as I looked around, but there was no one there, just shadows and silence. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but as I turned to leave, I felt a presence, cold and heavy, like a hand pressing on my shoulder. I spun around, and for a split second, I saw her, Betty Lou. She was standing there, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes wide and filled with terror. She looked right at me, her mouth moving as if trying to speak, but no words came out. I stood frozen, watching her as she reached out, her hand trembling, and then, just as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone, leaving me alone in the dark, with nothing but the memory of her terrified gaze. After that night, I became obsessed. The haunting wasn't confined to that empty lot. It followed me. I'd see her reflection in shop windows, her shadow slipping around corners, always just out of reach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice, pleading for help. The whispers grew louder, filling my nights with an eerie chorus of voices. Sometimes, I'd hear her laughter, soft and distant, like the memory of a forgotten song. Other times, it was her scream, a blood-curdling cry that would jolt me awake, drenched in sweat. I tried to talk to my fellow detectives, but no one believed me. They said it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even guilt, but I knew it was something more. Betty Lou was trapped, bound to this world by the brutal mystery of her death, and I was the only one who could help her. Desperate for answers, I began digging through old records, searching for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. It was then that I found something chilling. Betty Lou wasn't the first. Over the years, several young women had disappeared in the same area, each one vanishing without a trace, their cases unsolved, their names forgotten. I realized then that Betty's killer wasn't just a man. He was something darker, something that had been lurking in the Bronx for years, feeding off the fear of young women, claiming their lives one by one, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. I returned to the crime scene, armed with the knowledge of those who had come before her. This time, I was ready. I brought an old camera, hoping to capture something, anything that might explain the strange phenomena. As I stood in the empty lot, the air grew colder, and the whispers began again. But this time, they were louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices overlapping, each one crying out for justice. And then, she appeared. Betty Lou stood in the shadows, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She raised her hand, pointing toward the far end of the lot, where the warehouse loomed like a silent sentinel. I followed her gaze, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it, a faint outline of a figure, moving through the shadows, watching me with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. My heart raced as I raised the camera, snapping a picture just as the figure vanished. When I developed the film the next day, I saw him clearly for the first time, a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes, his face twisted in a cruel smile. It was the same face that had haunted Betty Lou, the same face that had watched her in the final moments of her life. But it wasn't just a photograph. It was a message, a warning. The killer was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. I never solved Betty Lou's murder. The case went cold, filed away in the depths of the precinct. Another unsolved mystery lost to time. But I never forgot her, and she never let me forget. To this day, I still see her sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the city falls silent and the shadows grow long. I hear her voice in the wind, feel her presence in the darkness, a constant reminder of the secrets that lurk in the heart of the Bronx. Betty Lou may be gone, but her spirit remains, bound to the place where she met her end, a ghostly guardian watching over the city, waiting for the day her killer is brought to justice. And until that day comes, I'll keep searching, haunted by the memory of a girl whose story was never finished, whose voice still echoes in the darkest corners of New York City. Story number 7. The Long Island serial killer, Gilgo Beach Killer. The biting cold of late autumn wrapped around me as I stepped onto the desolate sands of Gilgo Beach. The waves crashed relentlessly against the shore, their rhythmic pounding echoing the turmoil inside me. My name is Detective Alex Monroe, and for the past year, I've been chasing shadows, both figurative and literal, in the haunting case of the Long Island serial killer. From 2010 onward, a string of disappearances had plagued the quiet communities of Gilgo Beach and Jones Beach. 10 to 16 women, predominantly those involved in the sex trade, had vanished without a trace. Their remains were eventually discovered along the coastline, each one a grim reminder of the predator lurking in our midst. Despite exhaustive investigations, the killer remained elusive, slipping through our fingers like the very sand beneath our feet. Tonight, under a crescent moon, I returned to the scene where it all began. The air was thick with fog, the kind that swallowed sound and sight, leaving only a suffocating silence. As I approached the latest site of discovery, an eerie feeling settled over me, a sense that I wasn't alone. The area was cordoned off, yellow tape fluttering weakly in the cold breeze. Uniformed officers stood guard, their faces grim as they awaited further instructions. I took a deep breath, my breath visible in the frigid air, and stepped forward. Detective Monroe, Officer Ramirez greeted me, his voice a low rumble. "We've got something unusual here." I followed him to a freshly disturbed patch of sand, marked by a small, unmarked grave. As we examined the site, the familiar dread washed over me. The victim was female, her identity still unknown, but the signs of struggle were unmistakable. This one felt different. There was an unnatural stillness to her, as if she was holding her breath, waiting for something. "Looks like the same pattern," I muttered, scanning the perimeter. "But Ramirez, have you noticed anything strange?" He glanced at me, his expression cautious. "You mean like paranormal activity?" I nodded slowly. Over the months, the case had taken a bizarre turn. Witnesses reported seeing fleeting shadows, hearing disembodied whispers, and feeling inexplicable chills near the burial sites. Some even claimed to see apparitions of the victims, their eyes hollow with sorrow and fear. "Let's keep an open mind," I replied, though my skepticism battled with the mounting evidence. "Anything to help us find the killer." As night deepened, the beach transformed into a ghostly landscape. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting silvery paths that seemed to lead nowhere. I decided to stay late, hoping the solitude would bring clarity. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the distant calls of nocturnal birds and the persistent rhythm of the waves. Around midnight, the temperature plummeted. I wrapped my coat tighter, shivering as a dense fog rolled in, obscuring my vision. That's when I heard it, a soft, mournful whisper carried by the wind. "Help us!" I spun around, flashlight in hand, searching for the source. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty sand. My heart pounded in my chest, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but the whisper persisted, growing louder and more urgent. "Help us!" Determined to confront whatever was out there, I ventured deeper into the fog. The beach seemed endless, the shoreline swallowed by the mist. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on me. Suddenly, the whispers converged into a cacophony of voices, each one overlapping the other, creating a haunting symphony of despair. A figure emerged from the haze, a woman in a tattered dress, her face pale and eyes hollow. She floated above the ground, her presence ethereal and sorrowful. "Why did you let them suffer?" she wailed, her voice echoing across the beach. I took a step forward, my voice barely steady. "Who are you? What do you want?" Her form shimmered, the outlines of other apparitions materializing beside her, ghostly figures of the victims, their expressions etched with pain. "You saw us, but you did nothing. We were abandoned, forgotten." I felt a surge of guilt, memories of failed leads and missed opportunities flooding my mind. "I'm sorry. We're doing everything we can to find the truth." The apparitions swirled around me, their whispers intensifying. "The truth lies in the darkness. Find him. Set us free." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The whispers transformed into screams, a cacophony of anguish that threatened to shatter my sanity. I stumbled back, the fog thickening around me, reducing visibility to mere feet. Panic clawed at my throat as the spectral figures pressed closer, their sorrow morphing into malevolent intent. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very essence of their torment sought to consume me. Desperate to escape, I turned to run, but the beach stretched infinitely, the path ahead obscured by the relentless fog. The apparitions closed in, their presence overwhelming, until only darkness remained. I felt an invisible force pulling me downward, the weight of their unresolved pain dragging me into the abyss. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, a blinding light pierced through the darkness. The apparitions recoiled, their forms dissipating into the night air. I gasped for breath, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as quickly as it had descended. The first light of dawn broke over Gilgo Beach, the fog dissipating with the rising sun. I stood alone, shaken to my core, the echoes of the night's horrors lingering in my mind. The case still remained unsolved, but that night had given me a glimpse into the depths of its darkness, both human and supernatural. As I walked back to the station, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on me. The spirits of Gilgo Beach were not just victims of a serial killer. They were embodiments of the collective guilt and failures of our society. Their whispers were a haunting reminder of the lives lost and the justice denied. Determined to honor their memory, I redoubled my efforts, driven by the spectral plea for closure. The case became my obsession, a relentless pursuit not just for the truth, but for redemption. I knew that solving the mystery would not only bring peace to the victims, but also lay to rest the restless spirits that roamed the sands of Gilgo Beach. Years later, the case remains open, the killer still at large, but the whispers of that night continue to guide me. The line between reality and the supernatural has blurred, and I walk the thin edge, ever vigilant, haunted by the voices of the lost. Story number 8. The Flatiron Murder, 1947. New York in 1947 was a different world. The war had ended, but shadows lingered in the narrow streets and towering buildings, and some scars ran too deep to be healed. The city was restless, filled with whispers, secrets, and unfinished stories. My name is Detective Frank Russo, and in the summer of that year, I found myself drawn into one of the city's darkest mysteries, the murder of Mary Smith in the heart of the Flatiron District. Mary was a young woman, a secretary at a local law office. She was smart, vibrant, the kind of girl everyone noticed but few truly knew. One evening, she left work and disappeared into the night, only to be found hours later, her lifeless body lying at the base of the Flatiron Building. The scene was gruesome. Mary's body was marked with bruises, and her expression was frozen in terror. We arrived on the scene just as the first light of dawn broke over the city. The Flatiron Building cast a long shadow over Mary's body, almost as if it, too, held secrets of its own. I'd seen murders before, but something about this one felt different, felt wrong. The air was thick with an inexplicable chill, and as I examined Mary's body, a strange feeling crept over me, like someone was watching us. The investigation quickly became a labyrinth of dead ends and conflicting clues. Witnesses gave contradicting accounts. Some swore they'd seen her walking alone, while others claimed she was arguing with a man in a dark coat. But no one could agree on his face, or even his height. The evidence we did have seemed to dissolve like smoke every time we tried to piece it together. It was as if the case itself didn't want to be solved. Days turned into weeks, and Mary's ghost began to haunt me, not literally, but in the way she had died. Her fear seared into my mind. Her last moments were etched into my memory. I could feel her presence every time I walked the narrow streets of the Flatiron District. It was as if she was waiting for something, or someone. One night, I returned to the scene, driven by a feeling I couldn't shake. The street was quiet, the city around me asleep. I walked around the base of the Flatiron Building, retracing Mary's last known steps, hoping for something, anything that would explain what had happened to her. The air grew cold, and a thick fog rolled in, unusual for a summer night. I heard the soft tap of footsteps echoing behind me. I spun around, hand on my gun, but saw nothing, just the empty street stretching out into the darkness. The sound stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. Then I saw her, standing at the corner of the street, her pale figure illuminated by the glow of a street lamp. Was Mary. Her dress was torn, her face expressionless, but her eyes held a sorrow that chilled me to the core. She stared at me, as if trying to communicate something, some final message from the other side. "Mary," I whispered, taking a tentative step toward her. She didn't move, but her gaze shifted to the base of the building, as if drawing my attention to something hidden. I followed her line of sight, my flashlight illuminating the worn stone wall, and there, carved into the stone, were strange symbols, faint but unmistakable. I reached out to trace them, feeling a chill seep into my fingers as I did. The symbols seemed to pulse beneath my touch, and as I traced each line, a flood of images filled my mind. Mary, walking alone, a shadowy figure following her, the feeling of dread that grew as she tried to run. The street around me faded, and suddenly, I was there, reliving her final moments. I saw him, the man in the dark coat, his face obscured, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of purpose. I felt Mary's fear, her desperate attempts to escape, the helplessness as he caught up to her. I stumbled back, breaking free from the vision, my heart racing. Mary's figure was gone, but the memory of her fear lingered, thick and suffocating. I looked around, the symbols on the wall seeming to glow faintly in the moonlight. Whatever had happened to Mary, it wasn't just a simple murder. There was something darker at play, something that defied logic and reason. Determined to find answers, I returned to the precinct and began researching the symbols I had seen. My search led me down a rabbit hole of occult practices, rituals meant to bind souls, to trap them in this world. The more I read, the more I realized that Mary's death wasn't random. She had been chosen, marked by forces that lay beyond our understanding. As the investigation continued, I started noticing strange things. Objects in my apartment would move on their own, lights flickering at odd hours, shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. And then there were the whispers, soft, pleading voices that echoed in my ears when I was alone. Mary's voice was among them, a faint, desperate cry that seemed to grow louder each night. One evening, as I reviewed the case files, the room grew cold. The lights flickered, casting elongated shadows across the walls. The air grew thick, and I felt a presence, heavy and oppressive, filling the room. The whispers grew louder, the voices blending into a symphony of sorrow and anger. "Help us!" I froze, feeling the weight of 1,000 souls pressing down on me. The air was thick with despair, a tangible force that seemed to claw at my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it out, but the voices persisted, each one a reminder of the lives that had been lost, the secrets that had been buried. Then, in a sudden moment of clarity, I understood. Mary's death wasn't an isolated incident. She was part of something larger, a dark ritual that had been carried out in the shadows of the Flatiron District for years. Her killer was a vessel, a conduit for something ancient and malevolent, a force that thrived on fear and pain. Determined to put an end to it, I returned to the Flatiron building one last time, armed with the knowledge I had gathered. The streets were deserted, the city around me silent as I approached the spot where Mary had died. The symbols were still there, faint but pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to resonate with the very ground beneath my feet. I began the ritual I had learned, reciting the words that would sever the connection, that would release the spirits trapped by the dark force that had claimed Mary's life. The air grew colder, the shadows around me swirling as if alive. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices crying out in pain and anger. As I reached the final words, a piercing scream filled the air. The shadows coalesced into a figure, twisted, grotesque form that radiated malevolence. It lunged at me, its eyes gleaming with a hatred that was beyond human. I held my ground, finishing the ritual, the words tumbling from my lips as the figure writhed and screamed, its form dissolving into darkness. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as the last remnants of the entity faded into nothingness. In the silence that followed, I felt a sense of peace, a calm that had been absent from the Flatiron District for far too long. The symbols on the wall faded, their power broken, and the whispers ceased, leaving only the quiet hum of the city around me. Mary's spirit, and the spirits of countless others, had finally found rest. The mystery of her death would remain unsolved in the eyes of the world. But I knew the truth. The Flatiron District had been cleansed, its dark secrets laid to rest. As I walked away, I felt a presence beside me, a faint warmth that I knew was Mary, a silent thank you for giving her the peace she had been denied. The city around me was alive again, the shadows no longer filled with fear, and for the first time since that fateful summer, I felt free. But even now, I can still hear her voice in the quiet moments, a gentle reminder of the darkness that once lurked in the heart of the Flatiron District. Story number 9. The Chelsea Hotel Murders. The Chelsea Hotel stood proud and ominous on West 23rd Street, casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch far beyond its walls. To most, it was a haven for the creative, a sanctuary for artists, musicians, and poets seeking inspiration. But to me, Detective Robert Carson, it was a place that reeked of death and secrets, an enigma wrapped in faded wallpaper and creaky floorboards. I'd been a cop in Manhattan for over 2 decades, and I'd seen my fair share of grim scenes. But the Chelsea Hotel was different. Every time I set foot inside its halls, a heavy, unnatural chill settled on me, like the walls themselves were watching, whispering secrets that I would never fully understand. But it was only when I was called to investigate the sudden death of a young artist, Sam Reynolds, that I began to understand just how deep the darkness at the Chelsea ran. Sam was a painter, a Brooklyn native who'd found his way to Chelsea just a month prior. His body was discovered in room 204, sprawled on the floor with his arms outstretched and eyes wide open. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just him, staring up at the cracked ceiling with a look of sheer terror frozen on his face. As I examined the room, something didn't sit right. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to cling to every corner, refusing to be dispersed by my flashlight. I spotted Sam's last painting propped against the wall, a grotesque, surreal landscape of distorted faces and dark figures that looked like they were clawing their way out of the canvas. The more I stared at it, the more I felt as if the figures were watching me, waiting. It wasn't long before I learned that Sam wasn't the first. The Chelsea Hotel had a grim history that stretched back decades. I remembered the death of Dylan Thomas, the celebrated poet who had allegedly drunk himself to death there in 1953. But whispers circulated about that night, whispers that claimed Thomas hadn't simply drunk himself into oblivion. Over the years, other artists had also met similar fates, their deaths shrouded in mystery, each one leaving behind a trail of questions and half-finished masterpieces that seemed haunted by a force beyond comprehension. I spoke to some of the longtime residents of the hotel, hoping for answers, but most were reluctant to talk. A few mentioned strange sounds in the middle of the night, ghostly figures lurking in the halls, and voices that would drift through the air when no one was around. One night, I returned to the Chelsea after hours, determined to dig deeper. The lobby was empty, save for a flickering light that cast unsettling shadows on the walls. I made my way to the narrow staircase, the silence pressing against me as I climbed to the second floor. Sam's room was at the end of the hall, and as I approached it, a chilling breeze blew past, despite the fact that all the windows were closed. Standing in front of room 204, I took a deep breath and entered. The air was colder than before, and the shadows seemed thicker, almost tangible. The painting was still there, leaning against the wall, but the figures seemed to have shifted, their faces contorted in agony, their eyes pleading. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but I forced myself to stay. As I moved to examine the room, I heard a faint whisper. I spun around, flashlight raised, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until I could make out words. "Help us!" The voice was faint, almost inaudible, but filled with such despair that I couldn't ignore it. I scanned the room, my heart pounding, and that's when I noticed it. A small door in the corner, half hidden behind a tattered curtain. It looked like a closet, but the door was covered in strange symbols, scratched into the wood as if by desperate, trembling hands. I reached out, my hand shaking as I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a cramped, dark space. Inside, there was nothing but a worn journal, its cover faded and edges frayed. I picked it up, flipping through the pages, and recognized the handwriting. It was Sam's journal, filled with sketches and ramblings about his time at the Chelsea. But as I read, his words grew darker, more frantic. He wrote of strange dreams, of shadows that watched him from the corners of his room, and voices that whispered secrets in his ears at night. He spoke of a presence, a darkness that lurked within the walls, feeding off the artists who lived there, using them to create pieces that were not entirely their own. As I read, the whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, each one desperate, pleading. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the shadows, faces twisted in agony, trapped within the walls, their eyes hollow and empty. Panicked, I stumbled out of the room, clutching the journal to my chest. I made my way back to the lobby, breathing heavily as I tried to make sense of what I had just experienced. But before I could leave, an elderly man approached me. He was one of the longtime residents I'd spoken to earlier, a retired musician named Eddie. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, too shaken to speak. "They're trapped," he said, his eyes distant. "The hotel, it feeds on them. It's always been that way. Every artist, every poet, every musician who's ever stayed here, they leave a part of themselves behind, some more than others." I didn't know what to say. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of an old man. But after what I'd seen, I couldn't deny that there was something sinister lurking within the Chelsea. Before I left that night, Eddie gave me one last piece of advice. If you value your soul, detective, don't come back here after dark. The hotel, it doesn't let go. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Chelsea was watching me. I'd see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hear faint whispers in my apartment late at night. The journal haunted me, its pages filled with Sam's desperate words, his final testament to the horrors he'd experienced. One night, unable to resist, I returned to the Chelsea, determined to put an end to the nightmare. Armed with the journal, I climbed the stairs to room 204, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The door creaked open as I entered, and the air grew cold once more. The painting was still there, but this time, the figures were clearer. They were the faces of the artists who had died within the hotel Dylan Thomas, Sam Reynolds, and countless others, their eyes filled with terror and despair. They stared at me, their mouths open in silent screams. I opened the journal, reading the final passage aloud, hoping that it would bring them peace. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around me, and the voices rose to a deafening crescendo. Free us! The walls began to shake, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the hotel itself was resisting, fighting to keep its secrets buried. But I kept reading, my voice trembling as I recited Sam's last words. With a final, shuddering breath, the voices fell silent, and the room grew still. The painting faded, the faces disappearing into the canvas, leaving nothing but an empty, desolate landscape. I left the Chelsea Hotel that night, the weight of its history pressing down on me. The hotel still stands, its walls filled with the echoes of those who came before, but I knew that I could never return. The darkness within its walls was ancient, hungry, and I had come too close to becoming its next victim. To this day, I can still hear the whispers, faint but insistent, a reminder of the souls trapped within the Chelsea's walls. The hotel has taken many, but it let me go for now. And every so often, when I walk down 23rd Street, I feel its gaze upon me, waiting, watching, biding its time. Story number 10. The Central Park Jogger Case, 1989. The night air in Central Park was unnervingly silent, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just 30 years ago. My name is Detective John Miller, and I was one of the officers thrust into the nightmare that became the Central Park Jogger Case of 1989. Even now, decades later, the shadows of that night linger, not just in my memory but in the very fabric of the park itself. It was April 19th, 1989, a night that should have been ordinary for a jogger like Trisha Maley. Instead, it became the epicenter of a tragedy that exposed the darkest corners of our justice system. As a young detective eager to make his mark, I was assigned to lead the investigation. Little did I know, this case would haunt me for the rest of my life. The park was a sprawling expanse of green, a sanctuary in the heart of Manhattan. That night, the usual sounds of footsteps and distant traffic were replaced by Trisha's desperate screams. We arrived to find her lifeless body, brutally assaulted, lying near the reservoir. The horror of the scene was indescribable. But what struck me even more was the fear in her eyes, a fear that seemed to reach out from beyond the grave. As the investigation began, the media frenzy was immediate and relentless. 5 teenagers, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, and Corey Wise were swiftly identified as suspects. Their confessions, coerced under intense interrogation, sealed their fates. The courtroom was a battleground of prejudice and haste, and despite the lack of concrete evidence, they were convicted and sentenced to years behind bars. Years passed, and the truth remained elusive until Matias Reyes, a career criminal with a history of violent offenses, confessed to the crime. DNA evidence corroborated his statement, exonerating the Central Park Five. The weight of their wrongful convictions was a scar on our community. a testament to systemic failures and racial biases. Yet, the psychological toll on me was something I hadn't anticipated. Decades later, I retired from the force, hoping to leave the ghosts of that case behind. But Central Park has a way of holding onto its secrets, and some shadows refuse to fade. Recently, strange occurrences have plagued my life. Whispers in the wind, fleeting apparitions in the fog, and nightmares that pull me back to that fateful night. One evening, unable to shake the feeling of unfinished business, I decided to return to the park. The moon hung low, casting eerie silhouettes among the trees. I walked the familiar path to the reservoir, the site of Trisha's attack, now a place of both beauty and sorrow. As I approached, a dense mist enveloped the area, reducing visibility to mere feet. The air grew colder, and an unsettling silence settled around me. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the fog, slow, deliberate, and hauntingly familiar. My heart pounded as I strained to see through the haze. Out of the mist emerged a figure, a young man, his face pale and eyes hollow. It was Kevin Richardson, one of the Central Park Five. Except, he was different. His form flickered like a candle flame, barely holding shape against the oppressive darkness. Detective Miller. His voice was a mere whisper, yet it resonated with a sorrow that pierced my soul. You left us to suffer. I swallowed hard, the guilt weighing heavily on me. Kevin, I was just following orders. I believed their confessions were true. Kevin's apparition drifted closer, his presence both menacing and pitiable. Confessions built on fear and prejudice. We were innocent. Look what it did to us. Before I could respond, the scene shifted. The park transformed around us, the serene beauty now marred by the horrors of that night. Trisha's screams echoed through the trees, mingling with the anguished cries of the wrongly convicted. The air was thick with despair, a palpable manifestation of collective guilt and unresolved pain. Help us, Kevin's ghost pleaded, reaching out a translucent hand. Set us free from these shadows. I tried to speak, but my voice was lost in the cacophony of torment that surrounded us. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, a reminder of the lives forever altered by our actions. In that moment, I realized that true justice was not just about righting the wrongs of the past, but also about seeking redemption for the mistakes that lingered in the present. The spirits of the Central Park Five and Trisha Maylee were not just remnants of a tragic case. They were reminders of the fragility of truth and the devastating impact of prejudice. Determined to honor their memory and seek solace for my own haunted conscience, I vowed to ensure that their stories were never forgotten. I began writing, documenting not just the facts of the case, but the emotional and psychological scars it left on everyone involved. Through my writing, I hoped to bring light to the darkness that still clung to Central Park, offering a path toward healing and reconciliation. As dawn broke, the mist lifted, and the park returned to its peaceful state. The apparitions faded, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a renewed sense of purpose. The ghosts of Queens had spoken, and it was up to me to listen and act. Walking away from the reservoir, I felt a sense of closure. The shadows of the past would always linger, but acknowledging them was the first step toward breaking free from their grasp. Central Park, with its storied history and lingering spirits, remained a place of both beauty and sorrow, a testament to the enduring human spirit and the quest for justice. And as I left the park that morning, I knew that the whispers of Queens would continue to echo, urging us to remember, to empathize, and to strive for a world where no one would ever have to suffer in silence again. Story number 11. The case of Kitty Genovese, 1964. I still remember the night like it was yesterday, despite it having happened nearly 60 years ago. The humid air of Queens pressed against my skin as I navigated the narrow streets, my mind already burdened with the weight of an unsolved case that had haunted me ever since. My name is Detective Daniel Harris, and I was one of the officers assigned to investigate the brutal murder of Kitty Genovese on March 13th, 1964. A case that would etch itself into the annals of New York City's darkest mysteries. The apartment building where Kitty lived was unassuming, nestled between the bustling avenues of Queens. That night, the streets were quieter than usual, the usual cacophony of honking cars and chattering pedestrians subdued under a heavy blanket of darkness. The call had come in just after midnight, a woman screaming for help, desperate cries echoing through the alleyways. When my partner, Officer Lee, and I arrived, we found Kitty struggling against a shadowy figure in the dimly lit corridor. The attacker moved with an eerie grace, his face obscured by the darkness. The screams were muffled, almost ghostly, as if they were being swallowed by the night itself. We attempted to intervene, but the assailant vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the lingering echoes of Kitty's terror. The initial reports claimed that 38 witnesses had seen the attack but did nothing to help. As we canvassed the area, searching for any sign of the perpetrator, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking presence. Every flicker of light a fleeting glimpse of something otherworldly. Days turned into weeks, and the case grew colder. The number of witnesses was called into question, but the impact of that night lingered like a specter over the community. People spoke in hushed tones about the Genovese phenomenon, debating the moral failings of society. Yet, there was an undercurrent of something far more sinister, something that defied logical explanation. One evening, as I sat in my cramped office, poring over the scant evidence we had collected, a chill swept through the room. The temperature dropped inexplicably, and the lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I glanced around, feeling a presence behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing, only the oppressive silence of an empty office. Determined to find answers, I returned to Kitty's apartment one last time. The place felt different now, haunted by memories that refused to fade. As I walked through the familiar hallway, the air grew thick with a palpable tension. I approached Kitty's door, the scene of her final moments, and pushed it open. The room was just as it had been that night, disheveled, cold, and silent, but something was off. The air felt heavy, as if weighted by sorrow and anger. I moved towards the window, peering out into the darkened street, when suddenly, the room seemed to warp around me. The walls pulsed with an unnatural energy, and the whispers of the past filled my ears. "Kitty, help us." The voice was faint, barely audible over the beating of my own heart. I spun around, flashlight in hand, searching for the source. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure ghostly and ethereal, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. It was Kitty. Her eyes, once full of life, now mirrored an abyss of despair. "You saw us," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "You watched and did nothing. Now, we can never rest." I felt a surge of guilt and fear, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. "Kitty, I'm sorry. We tried to help," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The apparition floated closer, her presence both haunting and sorrowful. "It's not just us," she continued. "It's all of us who were ignored, who were too afraid to act. We're trapped here, reliving that night forever." As she spoke, the room around me shifted. I found myself standing in the very alley where Kitty had been attacked. The sounds of that horrific night playing out in a loop. The screams, the struggle, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. It was all too vivid, too real. Desperate to break free, I reached out to her, but my hand passed through her spectral form. "There has to be a way to help you," pleaded, "to let you go." Kitty's ghost seemed to fade slightly, her expression softening. "Find the truth," she urged. "Expose what really happened that night. Only then can we find peace." Determined to end the curse that bound these restless spirits, I delved deeper into the case, uncovering truths that had been buried beneath layers of fear and indifference. Old witness statements revealed inconsistencies, and forgotten evidence began to surface, pointing to a darker motive behind Kitty's murder, one that involved betrayal and hidden agendas within the very community meant to protect her. As I pieced together the fragments of that tragic night, the hauntings intensified, the spirits grew restless, their appearances more frequent and their pleas more urgent. It became clear that their suffering was tied to the unresolved injustices that had been swept under the rug by society's apathy. One stormy night, as lightning illuminated the sky and thunder rumbled through the streets of Queens, I returned to Kitty's apartment with a newfound purpose. Armed with the truth, I confronted the supernatural forces that sought to keep their secrets hidden. The air crackled with energy as the spirits gathered around me, their presence both menacing and mournful. I found the truth, I declared, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. I will make sure your story is heard, and justice is served. The room responded with a violent gust of wind, the spirits swirling in a vortex of rage and sorrow. Kitty's ghost approached me once more, her eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. "Do it," she whispered. "Bring our story to light." With the truth laid bare, the spirits began to dissipate, their forms fading into the ether. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The apartment was silent once more, the haunting whispers silenced by the revelation of their plight. As dawn broke over Queens, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a warm, healing light. I knew that while the ghosts of that night would always linger in the shadows, their stories would finally be told, ensuring that their suffering was never forgotten. Walking away from Kitty's apartment, I felt a sense of closure and redemption. The case that had haunted me for decades was finally resolved, not through the lens of human failure alone, but with an understanding of the supernatural forces that had kept the truth buried for so long. But as I glanced back one last time, a faint figure stood at the window, Kitty's ghost, smiling gently before vanishing into the morning light. "Thank you," she whispered, and I knew that her spirit, along with those of the other victims, had finally found the peace they so desperately sought. Whispers in Queens delves into the psychological and supernatural repercussions of one of New York City's most infamous unsolved cases. Through Detective Michael O'Connor's journey, the story explores themes of guilt, redemption, and the enduring impact of tragedy, all wrapped in a Stephen King-inspired atmosphere of suspense and horror. The narrative not only honors Kitty Genovese's memory, but also serves as a haunting reminder of the importance of compassion and intervention in the face of human suffering. Story number 12. The Blackout Ripper, 2003. The summer of 2003 in New York City was suffocating. The relentless heat had everyone desperate for relief, but nothing could prepare me for the darkness that was about to descend. My name is Detective Laura Martinez, and I was assigned to one of the most harrowing cases of my career, the hunt for the Blackout Ripper. It started innocently enough. Reports of women attacked during the infamous blackout of July 13th. The city plunged into darkness. Chaos reigned, and amidst the confusion, predators stalked the streets. The media quickly dubbed him the Blackout Ripper, drawing parallels to the Yorkshire Ripperback in the UK. 6 women were found brutally assaulted, their bodies marked with eerie symbols that no one could decipher. The killer vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. From the moment we began the investigation, something felt off. The blackout wasn't a natural occurrence. It was orchestrated, precise, almost as if the Ripper used it as a cover for his heinous acts. Each crime scene was meticulously staged, the symbols carved into the victim's skin glowing faintly under the moonlight, hinting at a dark ritual. One night, as I pored over the case files in the dimly lit precinct, the power flickered ominously, the lights dimmed, and an unsettling chill filled the room. The air grew thick, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I looked up, heart pounding, to see a figure standing at the edge of my desk, a woman in a tattered dress. her eyes hollow with pain. "Help us," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant scream. I blinked, and she was gone, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence. Shaken, I tried to rationalize it as stress-induced hallucinations, but as days turned into weeks, the apparitions became more frequent. Crime scenes. I'd catch glimpses of ghostly figures lurking in the shadows, watching us without moving. The victims' families reported seeing their loved ones, restless and unable to find peace. The breakthrough came when we linked the symbols to ancient rituals found in obscure texts. It suggested that the Blackout Ripper wasn't just a serial killer but a practitioner of dark magic, seeking something beyond our understanding. The more we delved into the occult, the more the supernatural elements intertwined with the investigation. One particularly stormy night, the power went out again. Lightning illuminated the precinct in flashes of white, followed by an eerie darkness. We received a call from Central Park. Another attack had occurred. As we raced to the scene, the streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of the city silenced by the storm. At the park, we found the latest victim, her body positioned in a grotesque tableau, the symbols carved deeper and more sinister. As we examined the area, the air grew colder, and the fog rolled in thick and fast. Out of the mist emerged a shadowy figure, moving with unnatural speed towards us. The flashlight beams caught glimpses of a gaunt man with piercing eyes, his presence malevolent and commanding. "Stop investigating," he hissed, his voice a low growl that resonated in my bones. Some truths are better left buried. Before we could react, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Trembling, I realized that the Ripper was more than a man. He was a specter, bound by dark forces that made him nearly invincible. The line between reality and the supernatural was blurring, and our pursuit was leading us into realms we couldn't comprehend. Desperate for answers, I turned to an old mentor, Detective Samuel Green, who had dealt with cases involving the occult. His study was cluttered with ancient books and artifacts, a testament to his belief in forces beyond the physical world. "The symbols," I began, showing him the latest crime scene photos. "They're part of a ritual. I think the Ripper is trying to summon something or someone." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "If he's invoking dark magic, we might be dealing with more than just a killer. We need to disrupt the ritual before he completes whatever he's planning." As we strategized, the paranormal activity intensified. Ghostly apparitions began appearing not just at crime scenes but in our own lives. Colleagues disappearing only to return hours later, haunted by nightmares of the victims' final moments. The precinct became a place of fear and uncertainty, the shadows alive with the tormented souls we were trying to save. The final confrontation happened during a total blackout. We tracked the Ripper to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the perfect place for his dark ceremonies. Armed with talismans and protective symbols provided by Samuel, we entered the building, the darkness swallowing us whole. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the scent of decay. The Ripper stood at the center of a pentagram, chanting in a language none of us recognized. As he completed the ritual, portal began to open, swirling with dark energy. The apparitions of the victims materialized around us, their eyes pleading for salvation. "Stop!" I shouted, drawing the protective symbols around me. "End this now!" The Ripper turned, his eyes glowing with otherworldly power. "You cannot interfere. The balance must be restored." A fierce battle ensued, a clash of physical prowess and supernatural forces. The apparitions fought alongside us, their anguish fueling our determination. In a desperate move, I tackled the Ripper, disrupting the ritual and closing the portal. The dark energy erupted in a blinding flash, and the Ripper was consumed by the very darkness he sought to control. As the light faded, the apparitions began to dissipate, their souls finally finding peace. Exhausted and battered, we stood amidst the wreckage, the storm outside beginning to calm. The Blackout Ripper was no more, but the scars of the case lingered, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. In the aftermath, the community began to heal, the memory of the victims honored and their spirits laid to rest. But for me, the experience left an indelible mark. The shadows of Gilgo Beach and the restless spirits of Queens would always be a part of me. Whispers in the dark reminding me of the night we faced the supernatural and emerged victorious. As I walked away from the precinct, the first light of dawn breaking over the city skyline, I knew that some cases never truly end. They leave behind echoes, shadows that dance just beyond the edge of our perception, waiting for the next investigator brave enough to uncover the truths hidden in the darkness. New York may be the city that never sleeps, but some of its darkest secrets still lurk in the shadows, waiting to resurface. Which of these cases sent chills down your spine? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales from the heart of the unknown. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved.